Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues. My name is Bobo, and I have the great pleasure and honor to moderate what I think will be a thoroughly stimulating and lively debate about the future of Russia. Now, to discuss this subject, we have a most distinguished panel. Let me introduce them briefly. On my immediate left is Vladimir Milov, one of the most prominent members of Russia's liberal opposition and formerly Deputy Energy Minister to the Russian Federation. To his left is Alina Polyakova, Director of the Project on Global Democracy and Emerging Technology at the Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C. And to Alina's left is Brian Whitmore, Director of the Russia program at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, Vladimir Putin has been in power for so long, coming up to 2 decades, that many of us have become accustomed to talking about not Russia, but Putin's Russia. And yet, at the risk of stating the obvious, Russia is so much more than Putin. And so the purpose of our discussion today is to try and depersonalize Russia, to examine some of the long-term structural factors behind the political theater of Putin and Putinism. And so with this in mind, I want to put several questions to our panelists, but also to you in the audience, because I really hope you will play an active part. So let me lay out 4 questions, if I may. The first question is our problem fundamentally with Putin, or is Putin merely symptomatic of a larger Russian political and strategic culture? What do I mean by this? The historical emphasis on the strong leader, the concentration of state power, a kleptocratic patronage system, the ultra-centralization of the economy, and the obsession with great powerness, what Russians call державность. My second question to the panelists and to you is the Russian system and its underlying culture essentially unreformable? Or is this just lazy historical determinism on our part? The third question, if indeed a post-Putin Russia is feasible, then how might it arise? What would be its defining features? And would it necessarily be an improvement on the existing system, or would it threaten something even worse, perhaps some sort of hyper-nationalist populism? And finally, what is the prospect, according to you, our panelists, and you in the audience, of an eventual improvement in Russia-West relations? And on what basis might this be achieved? Or is the most that we can realistically expect an uneasy accommodation? So, Vladimir, please start.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. And we obviously have had a lot of debate on particularly these issues in connection with the 20-year anniversary of Putin's appointment as Yeltsin's successor. In August 1999, he was appointed the prime minister, and it's been already 20 years. So we obviously had a lot of revisiting and rethinking what went wrong. I actually shared with Bobo my op-ed on this matter, a lengthy philosophical op-ed, where I argue that actually what happened was not some sort of anomaly, was not a deviation from a normal democratic pattern of development, but in most of the post-Soviet space and even some Eastern European post-communist states, authoritarian restorations often happened. And in the former Soviet Union, it was more like a norm rather than a deviation for one simple reason, which is pretty clear to everybody who works on a daily basis in the grassroots Russian politics. Russian people, the majority of the society, did not have any experience of democratic governance at all throughout history. So they were absolutely unexperienced when they were thrown into this in the 90s, how to make government accountable, how to structure and organize yourselves and engage in political participation. It was particularly difficult because all the economic hardships. We have severely underestimated what a difficult task it was to reform the ruins of the Soviet legacy. Mm-hmm. When Yeltsin came to power, he promised that things would improve within 1 year, mm-hmm. which was obviously an understatement looking at the retrospective. So people obviously got tired of this very difficult and turbulent period, so there was a natural demand for a strong hand, for a person who might take away their civil liberties and political freedoms, but in return he promised to solve problems. On the background of that, we finally did reform the Soviet economy, and something new and more efficient had emerged, which had delivered the economic growth of early Putin's era, which was indeed one more factor contributing to the desire of Russians to give up the political life and concentrate on personal well-being. Putin or not Putin? I think, Bobo, the correct answer is both. Okay. Because the authoritarian restoration was not only natural, but as I also argue in my article, there were multiple attempts since the beginning of the perestroika, starting from the late Gorbachev period, because Gorbachev was the guy who accumulated all these conservatives around him who later attempted a coup d'etat. And in the end of 1989, he said his famous phrase about the so-called Democrats, meaning that in his view, perestroika went too far. So we always had multiple attempts of this authoritarian restoration by different parts of the nomenclatura. And it was pretty natural that one of the attempts succeeded when the society was really tired of reforms and was ready to give it away. So the only exception was that Putin and his team turned out to be extremely skillful in power grab and holding on to power. Yep. Right now, what you can see in Russia, obviously after Putin's reinstallment for another 6-year term, many of you saw that things are changing. They are not really quiet anymore. We saw unprecedented mass protests that were unseen in like 8-9 years. We see massive protest voting across different regions in Russia, not just Moscow. So something got broken. Even the famous Putin's approval ratings, which has been the only factor, I think, analyzed by many in the West in the past 4 or 5 years regarding Russia. Even they are plunging, so something is clearly changing. I will come to that in a moment, but in this new challenging environment, we can clearly see that Putin, over the past 20 years, have been building a very effective infrastructure to hold on under this siege. He's prepared on many fronts to hold on to power, and that was exactly specifically the focus of his work and the work of his team to defend their positions. So let me say it's a combination of certain objective historical trends, plus we have a specific skillful person who was at the wrong place in the wrong time. Actually, he did a very effective power grab, and he's prepared to hold on to it. Sure. But right now, you know, I would definitely not be fatalistic in this regard, because Putin's regime has been always, no matter what somebody might say, over 20 years, it always existed with the backing of popular opinion. Popular opinion was always in Russia on Putin's side, one way or another. In his first decade, people were satisfied with the economic performance. Once that has collapsed, he switched to playing on this imperial nostalgia and Crimea and all that stuff. But to operate in a situation when Putin does not have public support anymore, this is uncharted territory. This is something the system is really not prepared of. It has been always relying on public opinion, even in marginalizing the opposition and guys like us. they was always sticking to this specific sentiment that, look, nobody supports you. All the public support is with us.
Yeah.
So you might have whatever ideas you want, but people like Vladimir Vladimirovich and not Navalny. That is changing. And over the protests of the past few weeks and months, we actually saw that Putin has certain limits to what he can do in containing this discontent.
All right, but let me bring this in. There's a chess proverb which says the good player is always lucky. So Putin was lucky, but he was skillful enough to take advantage of his good fortune, like the spike in global oil prices, for example. But another way he was lucky was that it wasn't just that Putin was skillful, but that the liberals screwed up. So this is a bit of a personal question for you, and I'm not targeting you personally, but there's an argument that said the liberals really had themselves to blame for much of the failure of reform and for much of the discrediting of democratic liberal norms and values. So for all that Putin was skillful, the real problem was that the liberal elites, the intelligentsia, never really connected with the broader population. What do you say to critics?
I would definitely agree. Yes, the liberals did screw up, and when Putin emerged as a new strongman in his early tenure, clearly there was no political force, no popular political force, which were capable of defending democratic institutions and which were interested in doing so. So I also argue that to me, the most important part of Putin's regime evolution was not his appointment as Yeltsin's successor, but the merger of the two major rival parties in 2001, pro-Putin's party Единство and Lushkov's and Primakov's party Отечество, they merged. They used to compete, basically being two fairly similar nomenclatura corrupt groups, but they were competing, and competition is always better than monopoly.
Yeah.
Once they merged, they established a super monopoly which enjoyed the constitutional majority and dismantled the democratic freedoms, and there was nobody to resist. You're right. Liberals did screw up because those of them who worked with Yeltsin's government actually became entangled in this corrupt oligarchic reality, and those who resisted, particularly the perestroika-type intelligentsia who were supporting Yabloko party, they were politically incapacitated and incapable of achieving anything. So you're right, we did screw up. We're learning these lessons.
So what are the lessons?
And the lessons is that you always have to connect with the grassroots. If you consider Russian politics as the elite game, you just need to find the right place within this, current scope of nomenclatura, and you will be able to perform some democratic reforms or whatever, right? This is wrong. You have to have a strong connection with the grassroots base, which Putin did throughout his term. And again, I'm repeating, his power was always based on strong support from public opinion. And the liberals failed to connect. They always played these elite games, and they ended up without a real grassroots support base. We have learned that lesson, and we have reconnected big time in the past few years. So right now, Russian opposition is a grassroots force, and not the participant of this nomenclatura elite entourage.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. I want to move to Alina now, but I also want to leave you with a question, and to all of you. Surely this super monopoly, although there is much more public opposition to it, surely it's still essentially in place. It's pretty resilient. I remember a conversation with Lilia Shevtsova a few years ago, and she said 20% of Russians like Putin, 20% of Russians hate Putin, and 60% see no alternative. So it really doesn't matter what happens at either end. It's the middle that don't see an alternative. That's something for you to sort of think about and get back to me. Alina.
Thank you, Bobo, and thanks again to the Warsaw Security Forum for hosting this fantastic conference. I feel like we've been having this conversation for a very long time. But I suppose that means that Russia is still in vogue because it's still making problems for all of us in the political West. I want to go back to the original questions you posed a little bit, Bobo, and to also, I think, pick up on some of the themes that Vladimir was laying out. I think if I could kind of put my own analytical lens on what you were saying, Vladimir, about the evolution of Putin and Putinism, I tend to think that there have been 3 phases of Putin, right? The first phase defined by this contract of stability, prosperity. Then the second phase defined by the reemergence of make Russia great again, Russian nationalism. Mm-hmm. And now the third phase of global Russia, right? Yeah. A Russia that is once again a global actor on the world stage. And what's interesting about these 3 phases is, I was thinking about this yesterday, kind of looking back at the now very well-known Financial Times interview with Putin and what he lays out there on his views on liberalism. And what's, I think, been really striking to me is how consistent throughout those phases this messaging has been. So if we go back to the 2007 speech that Putin gives in Munich, that is often seen as sort of the beginning of a revanchist, resurgent Russia, where he lays out the strategic objective of undermining Western hegemony, especially US hegemony in the world. And then we fast forward to the recent interview earlier this year, and it seems like Putin is resting on his laurels, because it almost looks like everything he wanted to happen has happened, right? The West is divided. We have certainly our political problems in the United States. Certainly in Europe here, there are divisive issues around identity, economy, migration. There's Brexit. There are populist forces. Many of them are pro-Russian that are rising to the top. And so from Russia's perspective, I think if I'm sitting in the Kremlin and I look back at 2007 and I look at where I am now, it seems like the chess pieces have all fallen into place. I think the question here to me, of course, and this is part of the big debate, how much of that chessboard has been prepared by ourselves and how much of it did Russia help create? And I think going into that a little bit more, this question of whether we have a Putin problem or Russia problem, which is one of your questions, yeah. Bobo, I think is not a question we can even ask anymore, because there is no light, there is no difference between Putin and Putinism. Right? Putin embodies the system, which I know Brian will talk about, and the system embodies him, right? And I think what's interesting is that when you see Putin, there is no Putin, meaning as a person, right? There's just Putin, the president of Russia. There's just Putin who represents the system. And I think that has been cultivated over time in the same way that this anti-liberal, anti-globalist, anti-Western message has been cultivated in a very, very consistent and relatively strategic way over time as well. So I think with that being said, I think the other debate that we are having right now is whether there's an ideology to the geopolitical competition in which Russia is taking part. Whether, we talk about Putinism, but what is that? Is it just an empty concept? What are some of the values or principles that embody Putinism? Again, I know Brian will get into this, but I'm going to say, and maybe this is controversial, I don't know, my view on this has been that there is no ideology there, right? That this is not an ideological system, because when we think about ideology, we think about a coherent set of concepts that all fit together to produce a specific worldview, much like communism was an ideology, much like you could say liberalism is an ideology. And right now, if we look into Putin a little bit beyond, and into Putinism a little bit beyond the rhetoric around nationalism, the rhetoric around traditional values, the rhetoric around multipolarity, none of these things fit together. It's the soup, I think this was Aliyah Ko's concept. It's a soup, right? Yeah, yeah. And it's a soup that quickly falls apart once you start eating it, right? So I think what's interesting, though, is that right now, to my mind, the other piece of the debate is whether Russia, which is a declining power, as many people like to say, if we look at the economy, if we look at demographic trends, it doesn't seem to be set up to play a significant global role, but it is playing a global role, despite the relatively poor resources that the Russian government has, the Kremlin has at its disposal. But I think right now, actually, we might be entering a fourth phase, of Putinism or Putin or Russia broadly defined. And I think this phase is going to be defined by a Russia that will consistently be able to take advantage of the fact that we are looking elsewhere, right? Look at Africa, look at South America, look at many other places that we probably aren't even aware to what extent Russia's playing a role there, right? I think we're going to see a new phase emerge where the Russian-Chinese relationship increasingly defines a new world order that is not ideological. Again, I don't think it's about ideology. A new world order in which democracies are on a back foot, and this rise of proto-authoritarian states with Russia and China as sort of the model alliance here will present an alternative, and already does present an alternative model. So my concern is that Russia is a player in this chessboard. It's not the key player, but it's certainly pushing towards, I think, a fourth phase in the geopolitical system and the international order that democracies are not prepared to respond to.
Okay, great. You raise a number of issues. You highlight the fact that the cards seem to have fallen very nicely in place for Vladimir Putin, as much through Western failings. And it does rather strike me that in the West, we like to say that Russia is isolated. And yet, when one sits in China or even Australia or in other countries, you don't get the sense that Russia is isolated. It might be marginalized from the West, but then Russians would say, well, we always were marginalized from the West. So we're actually doing very well, thank you. You disliked us, you dismissed us, you denigrated us consistently. Now we've actually managed to find a dignified place in the world. So why fix it if it ain't broke? So that's one question. So does that mean, therefore, that Putin essentially says, well, there's no point changing anything. I'm doing very, very well, thank you. I might do a few tweaks here and there, burnish Russia's image as a good international citizen in certain parts of the world, like the Asia-Pacific, like the Middle East. But really, I'm not going to change anything fundamental. Russian foreign policy, as I've said it, is highly successful, at least within my frame of reference. What do you say to it?
Well, I will say that everything that the Kremlin does in foreign policy has a domestic cost, which is what Vladimir has been talking about. So all the resources spent, I do think Russia is more isolated than the United States still, but I think it's only isolated in the sense that we tend to think of isolation in terms of alliances. And yes, the US, if you look at the bigger picture, has far more alliances. European countries have far more alliances than Russia does, formal alliances. But what Russia has been very good at, what the Kremlin has been very good at, is inserting itself into various conflicts and making itself the power player in those conflicts. And that, I think, has been the greatest success of Russian foreign policy. It hasn't been successful domestically, because if we look at economic trends, certainly the Russian people are suffering for all of these relatively risky foreign policy moves the Kremlin has been carrying out. But look at the Middle East. Who is the key power player there now? It's not the United States anymore. Russia is the only country that can have conversations with Iran, with Syria, and with Israel, and with Turkey. You look towards China, and if we remember not that long ago, the previous US administration tried to pivot towards Asia. The Russian pivot towards Asia, I think, is proving to be, we can argue to what extent it's real, to what extent it's really emerging as a real partnership. I'm still quite skeptical about it. But it's certainly been far more successful than the US pivot to Asia in terms of forming a deeper set of economic, military, and diplomatic relationships with China. So I think to a certain extent it's yes and no, and this is the conundrum of Russia, right?
But I mean, this raises an interesting question, and picking up on a point you made earlier about ideology and the lack of it. Certainly, the old ideological confrontation, communism versus capitalism, no longer applies. But there is an alternative argument that says ideology has simply become fragmented and different. So that what Putin, the kind of ideology, if we understand ideology being a sort of set of predispositional influences, say, the kind of ideology that Putin reflects is actually a mid-19th century ideology, that trinity of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationhood or nation-mindedness. And so it's just that it's not ideology as we in the West might understand, but it's very much ideological in Russian terms. I don't know what you think about that.
Still, I'm not convinced by the argument, mainly because, again, it's not really coherent if you look at it.
Sure.
Right, and if you look at some of Russia's domestic policy, not coherent with the ideological kind of principles and points around traditional family structures, for example. But I think it doesn't even matter anymore, I think is the point that you're making, in a certain way that ideological debates at this point, basically since the end of the Cold War, have fragmented, right? And you could even ask the question, well, is the US still an ideological actor or not, right? And I think what unites Russia and China is not a set of common principles, right? That's what I mean. It's not an ideological partnership or alliance,
no, I'd
right?
agree with that.
It's a common desire to break Western hegemony. And to the extent to which that will continue to hold those two countries together, I'm very skeptical about, because you mentioned historical determinism or lazy historical determinism in your opening comments, Bobo, and maybe this is an example of it, but if we look at the long scope of Russian history, Russia has never been happy as a junior partner to any country. So how long will it continue to be okay with being the junior partner to China? Especially when the level of leverage from China is so much greater than the level of leverage that Russia has over China itself, is unclear to me.
Okay, all right. Brian, I wanted to bring in the sort of whole issue of strategic and political culture. You're doing a lot of work on what you call systema here, so.
Is that working? Okay, good. Thank you, Bobo, and thanks again to the organizers. It's an honor to be here again. I look forward to this conference every single year. Going on after these two is a tall order, so I'll try to live up to that. Bobo, I want to go back to your original question of do we have a Russia problem or do we have a Putin problem? And you're right, I'm doing a lot of work on this, which is leading me to the conclusion that we have a Russia problem. We have a systema problem. It's not a problem with Russians as Russians per se, but it's a problem with the system that I would argue has existed from the time of the Grand Duchy of Muscovy in various forms through the Russian Empire and through the Soviet Union. This is what the emigre Russian political scientist Alina calls systema. And systema is effectively a system of patron-client relationships, patronage networks, what the Russians call blatne svyazi, informal rules of engagement, or what the Russians call понятия, and a system in which power trumps law. My favorite way of illustrating this is to take the example of a contract. I just refinanced my mortgage, so I'm really familiar with contracts right now. When you sign a contract in the West, it is sacrosanct. It is a sacred document. It is enforceable in a court of law. Both parties will adhere to that contract or will pay the price for violating it. In Russia, and I've signed contracts in Russia. I was foolish enough to do this. I was young. When you sign a contract in Russia, your ability to enforce the contract is dependent on whether your Krisha or the other party's Krisha is stronger. Right? For those who don't know, Krisha refers to roof or protection in Russia. So it's a power game. Contracts are not sacred. They are not sacrosanct in this system. So in contrast to the Western system, which for all its faults and all of its deficiencies, and despite the fact that we don't always live up to it, at the end of the day, it's based on institutions. At the end of the day, it's based on certain norms. And the Russian system is more based on networks and it's based on power. Now, that leads me to the conclusion, agreeing with Gleb Pavlovsky, who said, if Putin were to leave tomorrow, he would be replaced by something exactly like him. And this doesn't necessarily mean somebody whose style of rule would be exactly like Putin's. He could be replaced by a liberal, but that liberal would still have to deal with systema and would still have to operate inside of systema, and would be shaped to a degree by Systema. I mean, Vladimir, I was very taken by your comment that the key moment was when Jedinstvo and Otечество merged in 2001. I agree with you, that was the key moment, but what were Jedinstvo and Otечество? They are effectively not political parties in the way we think of them in the West that have connections with the grassroots. These were two factions of Systema that were fighting each other, right? And when Putin kind of unified and consolidated the elite, it was completely natural for these two factions of Systema to come together. So I think this is what we're dealing with. And I mean, I'm watching the protests, with a lot of anticipation and a lot of hope right now. And I'm hoping that something has changed in Russia. But I'm concerned about what happens the day after, if and when the opposition is successful. Will you be able to dismantle Systema this time? Because it was going back to Bobo's question to you, did the liberals screw up in the first time around in the early 90s? I mean, I'm not sure if screw up is the right way to put it, because they effectively were going against Systema and they didn't even seem to try to dismantle Systema. Maybe they thought it was a hopeless battle. And it's just something for maybe you and I to talk about and to think about as we go forward. Do you think this time around, it's a tall order right now, but if in the unlikely event that you're successful, will you be able to dismantle Systema this time? Because if we don't, then this is going to lead, and I don't want to get into lazy historical determinism, but historically in Russia, this Systema has led to arbitrary rule at home and revanchism abroad. And I think this is something that we have to be aware of.
I'm going to bring it back to Vladimir in a moment, but I mean, are our expectations here not, we're being unrealistic, because obviously systemic change, unless you are lucky enough to have a successful, relatively bloodless revolution, systemic change is a long process. So clearly, a Putin successor would not be, or we think, would not be the antithesis of Putin. Putin's successor would come from within the system, the Systema, would reflect a broader Russian political and strategic culture and mentality. But maybe that successor might, in a kind of Gorbachev way, Gorbachev was very much a product of the system, but Gorbachev was nevertheless a reformer. Now, of course, he failed. He was a highly imperfect individual in many respects, but he did launch the Soviet Union in a different direction. So why can't a Putin successor do something similar? So because a successor always has the sort of arrogance of thinking that they can make a difference. So why can't a successor think that they can make a difference?
Well, I think you will have it, and I would certainly not argue that Gorbachev did not make a difference, but Gorbachev did not end Systema. He
didn't have enough time, though, did he?
He managed to change the formalistic structures around it.
Yeah.
But he didn't change the essence. And the essence had nothing to do with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. That was just an external manifestation of Systema. So I don't think it's impossible. It's very difficult. It takes a long time, and it could be incredibly socially disruptive. Because you have these power networks that are really, really entrenched. And Vladimir, you wrote about this in your article, hypothetically imagining what the world would have looked like if we saw a President Boris Nemtsov instead of a President Vladimir Putin. And Boris Yefimovich would have faced this entrenched system, just like Yeltsin would have before him and Gorbachev before him. Okay. Nobody's been successful in dismantling. I'd love to see it happen.
So how would the liberals today try and adapt or reform the system?
Bobo, let me first reflect on a couple of very important things you said. First, about the isolation of Russia.
Yeah.
Don't look at it as like, we still have somebody to talk to. Chinese, some folks in the Middle East, wherever.
Good point.
If you are a modern-day Russian, a talented, competitive Russian who wants to build a career, who wants to get educated, who wants to run business, you need normal relations with the West, period.
Yeah.
Normal relations between your country and the West. You have a lot of difficulties because these normal relations are non-existent.
Even in an emerging post-Western world.
Normal relations with China, with Iran, with Syria, with Zimbabwe, we don't care about that. We need normal relations with the West. to build
All right.
a normal, decent 21st century living
All
for
right.
an ordinary
Fair point.
modern Russian.
Okay.
So this is the isolation part is pretty important. Also, I wanted to go back to your remarks about the Lilia-Shevtsova proportions.
Yeah.
Now, these are rapidly shifting.
Yeah.
And I tell you this with a great grassroots experience, from traveling the regions to running as a candidate in these Moscow City Duma elections, to spending 30 days under arrest this August and talking to different inmates and policemen.
Yeah.
It's not 2060 anymore.
Yeah.
It's like 10-15% maximum who are solid supporters. It's at least twice as much who are fiercely against the system.
That's interesting.
Definitely a third. And yes, the remaining, I don't know how much, 50, 60, they are apolitical. Most of them don't have a clue, but they are shifting our way big
Right.
time.
Interesting.
Something got broken after the re-election of Putin, and I can go on for hours explaining that, but just believe me at this
Yes,
point.
absolutely.
This proportion
Absolutely.
is shifting. It's a long process, takes time and effort, and obviously there will be a challenge after Putin goes or the system goes, and there will be another chance to reform. What is really important is to break this sequence of playing the elite games and bring the population in. As a big player, which actually never truly happened in our history, we won't be able to solve the problem of forever. The predatory elite and nomenclatura will always be attempting to reinstall something,
Okay.
But the big game changer would be if we would convince big numbers of the population to get permanently engaged in politics and actively participate in a democratic process, something which we lacked, no matter did liberals screw up or not.
Sure.
It was not really relevant. So we are committed to doing that, and we are committed to make some big leap forward, which would make it very difficult for the Sistema, as you say, to re-emerge once again. Like, for instance, Boris Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, regardless of what you think about him, he did achieve a lot in dismantling a lot of foundations. His time produced a lot of people like me, or Navalny, or Yashin.
Yeah.
We are products of Yeltsin's era, let's be frank about it, right?
I would agree with that.
So, and we will never give up fighting, regardless of, come what may, as Boris Johnson.
Vladimir, I want to bring Alina in at this point.
I just wanted to make a quick comment. Maybe it's even a question for everyone. It seems to me that two things have to happen at the same time. One, there has to be enough tension in society, right, which we've seen some protests, but it doesn't seem that those have really penetrated the full of society yet in Russia. And on the other hand, there has to be some sort of fracturing of the elite, right, fracturing of the Sistema. And so far, we haven't seen these two things happen at the same time. But it seems to me that to undermine Putin's support, those are the two sources of authoritarian power that have to sort of break. And my question, I guess, to everyone, to you, Vladimir, since you spent so much time traveling around Russia, much more recently, is about the youth. Because there is completely conflictual reporting on whether these are pro-Putinists, right? I think The Economist about a year ago published an article called The Putins, right?
Yeah.
We assume that teenagers, young people are somehow more liberal, more democratic, but they're not. Or is that a misnomer? Are young people actually ready to be politically engaged?
All right, hold that thought. We'll come back to the youth. Brian, did you want to come in before I go to the audience?
Just a quick reaction, saying I agree with Alina on that you basically have change when you have a split in the elite or in Sistema, if you will, and you have either a popular uprising or massive popular discontent.
Right.
In 1991, you had that, and that allowed for massive change. But it also, in 99, 2000, it kind of allowed Sistema to reconsolidate itself. And it can also create something that looks like change, but is in reality a continuation of the status quo.
Okay. We started, I think, about, 10, 15 minutes late? Yeah, so I think we've got probably about 25 minutes. I'm going to open it out to questions and interventions. Can you please introduce yourselves, and please can you make the questions and interventions snappy? The lady in the middle there. Yeah, can pass her a microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Tatiana Asahina, and I would like to make a short commentary, a short objection to what Brian Whitmore said. I agree with you that this kind of social and political arrangement, which you described as CEPA, emerged at the end or in the last third of 15th century. It's 500 years old. But I think we shouldn't exaggerate the might and the ubiquitous character of this kind of relationship. Because what we mainly have, we have a system of private power, which is not a state in a Western notion, which is a system of public institutions. This is a system of private power which controls executive and controls the most profitable economic assets. But
Okay, just
my last phrase. So, the way through it is to make people, the population, to understand the instrumental character of democratic institutions. Yeah. What was omitted by the Democrats of the 90s? They were not interested in it. Now, people start to understand that participation in the elections is just the way to gain their personal, economic, and social goals. So this is a weak system.
Okay.
Thank you.
Gentleman in the middle there.
Hello, I'm Aliyah Ko. I study international relations at Kazan Federal University. I was born in 1998, and my childhood was pretty fine because the state was busy fixing its own things, and it wasn't really involved with the youth. I wasn't drafted into Jugendarmia, nothing like this.
Okay.
I was just left alone, and I find myself in a very bizarre world nowadays, where the youth is really captured and occupied by the state interest. My question regards the general alternative to Putin, which quite successfully does not exist. And I would prefer order and security to chaos, which I can only know from the previous experiences.
Okay, great. Lady in the middle there, just at the back.
Hi, Monica Bczkowska with GMF here in Warsaw. So I wanted to ask you about the recent announcement of Russia and Belarus about a possible confederacy between the two countries. So I wanted to ask you, how likely do you think it is that this will happen? And if it does happen, what would be the effects for both Russia, the West, and also for NATO?
Gentleman there.
Hi, thank you, Brian Griffin, new security leader. I wanted to push in a little bit on the Russia-China issue. We talked about it just very briefly. It seems as if I would argue against the no ideology proposition. I would say we're seeing states that are either willing to engage in the Westphalian system, or they are states that believe in the strong man wins. China is very squarely in the camp of not in the Westphalian system. Russia's gone back and forth. So if China continues to do what it does on the world stage, does that not encourage Russia to participate more fully in the Westphalian system?
All right, the last question for this round, gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Erik Borkowski. I'm from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and I manage the Russia and Eurasia program. My question is for Vladimir, but all the panelists can chime in. You mentioned that public opinion in Russia is changing, that Putin's ratings are falling, and yet that mostly has to do with the economic situation in the country and domestic policy, but not so much when it comes to foreign policy. It seems that most Russians are still fairly content with Russia's role in the world. They're still fairly content with the annexation of Crimea. And so my question is, if the liberal opposition were to come to power, what would be its foreign policy? And would the issue of Crimea be resolved? And also, one thing Alina Polyakova pointed out, Russia does not have an ideology right now. In the 1990s, there was a push to have a national idea in Russia.
Yeah.
Would the liberal opposition create a national idea for Russia?
Okay, Vladimir.
Of course, plain and simple, our national idea is that people matter. Russians matter for the first time in history. Always in the Russian history, during the Tsarism, the communist years, the Putin system, people were just but a material for building something, great geopolitical something, you know. Not anymore. People matter. That should be the essence of what the state exists for, to ensure well-being and development and providing opportunity for the Russian people, to take care about the Russian people. That's our national idea. And also this, you know, the famous point about chaos versus order. So the truth is, fact of the matter is, 90s were not chaos. I graduated university and I got a first job assignment in the 90s. I built my career in the 90s. It was a time of great opportunity. You opened the newspaper, and it had actually several additional pages with hiring ads. Something job hiring ads. Every newspaper featured that. Something unimaginable in modern day Russia, because in modern day Russia, ads are only about, we will help you deal with banks to solve your credit problems. We will help you deal with the bailiff service, stuff like that. Not hiring ads anymore.
But
and order,
Vladimir, some people would say that it's fine for, if you like, the educated classes like you. The 1990s were a time of great opportunity, but for everyone else, they were a time of huge socio-economic.
We have these resurgent conversations about the 90s, and as a matter of fact, it comes up in every conversation. But do you want to make... Listen, when I meet with, like, you know, a crowd of 30, 40, 50 people, when I talk to ordinary voters, somebody always comes up saying, do you want to be like it was in the 90s? And then the others start, not me. I know how this happens, so I keep silent this time around. The others start to yell at him, and what was the 90s? And what have changed since the 90s? More corruption, more inequality. Those in power are filthy rich, and we're basically at the same level. So, and the so-called order, which was pushed forward by Putin as his major idea, in reality is not order. And more people get to realize that.
Before I switch to Alina, did you want to say something about youth?
Youth, the key issue, no matter how you perceive all this, you know, a lot of young people also are engaged in this chaos versus order debate, and they also want to see a strong Russia, not a chaotic, anarchic Russia, which they perceive was Yeltsin's period and so on. But the one big obstacle for anybody among the Russian youth is a lack of opportunity. Like the old Soviet joke, when the father and son talk, and the son says, Father, when I grow up, I want to be a general. And the father answers, look, sonny, you got a problem because the general has his own son. Everything is already distributed, so there is no opportunity for the youth. And even those who supported the system, they feel it and become engaged in the opposition movement. There have been many converts recently from those who had supported Putin earlier on, but now they switched to supporting Navalny, just to make the long story short.
Alina, can you pick up on the Russia-China ideology, not ideology?
Yeah, so just very quickly on the disaffected youth, I mean, the other pattern is the out-migration that we're seeing, right? The giant exodus of skilled younger people that we don't have a huge amount of information about, but there was a large report that I worked on recently that came out from the Atlantic Council that looked at this Putin exodus issue, right? And there's a survey just in May that 43% of young Muscovites, I believe, all want to leave, right? So that, I think, signals exactly what you're pointing to. I wanted to pick up on two things. One was the Russia-Belarus question. The other was the should we encourage Russia to integrate as a way of pulling it apart from China, which is an old theory, right? And I think to some extent has failed multiple times. However, I still think it's incredibly powerful among some world leaders today. And I would just point to the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who seems to have potentially a strategic idea in mind in the sort of reset that he's currently pursuing with the Kremlin, which I think he will find out will inevitably fail because we've had 4 reset attempts now in the United States vis-a-vis Russia under every single administration, and every single one has ended worse than the previous one. So, but I think this notion that the real problem is China, Russia is a bit actor on the world stage, but they can really kind of sort of be a decisive actor in some way, which is very interesting, that Russia can be a decisive actor in this new era, as we call it, geostrategic competition. And so why don't we try to pull Russia away and integrate it into the West, whatever that means, so that China can be more isolated, so we have more leverage over China. I think this is incredibly misguided.
Yeah.
And I don't think, at least as long as we have the system that we have in Russia today, not even Putin, but the system that we have, this kind of strategy will inevitably fail.
Russia, Belarus, you were going to say.
What?
Russia, Belarus, you were going to say.
Yes. And very quickly on Russia, Belarus, how likely is it? This is, again, in the favorite parlor game of Russia hands in Washington and everywhere. This is the big game we all like to play. What's going to happen post-Putin? Is 2024 going to be a decisive year or not? The more interesting issue here is not what are the potential scenarios. One of them is this commonwealth between Belarus and Russia. Putin will be some sort of supreme leader, so he can still retain power in this other form versus changing the constitution to remain again, versus creating some sort of other agency, like the National Security Council that is basically empowered to be a sort of ruling body. And he would be the chairman of that council, right? There's also questions about whether they're going to follow the Kazakhstan path. Anyways, there's all kinds of theories about this. I'm very skeptical about the Belarus one because that involves Belarus, right? And so they have to be okay with it. And I don't think they want to be part of Russia in the same way that this kind of model would suggest.
Brian, can you address the issue about consensus on foreign policy versus dissension on domestic politics? The question that...
Yeah, first I actually also want to react to a couple of other things as well.
Yeah.
I want to follow up on Vladimir's saying that the new ideology is going to be people matter, and you went back to earlier saying we need to stop the elite games. I think this is a key change that may be happening right now and may even give the likes of me cause for optimism. Is that for the first time ever, I think, I'm beginning to see, at least in the younger generation, Russians looking at themselves as citizens and not as subjects. I mean, that's the way I would put it.
No,
and that is the very first, it's not a sufficient step, but it's a very necessary first step in breaking the power of Systema. So I think yourself and Alexei Navalny have done, I think, a great job at fostering this sense of citizenship in the youth. And I think this is a necessary but not sufficient condition for change. On Russia, Belarus, I want to just quickly say that fundamentally there's a distinction between how Putin sees this relationship and how Lukashenko sees it. Putin sees it as imperial, and Lukashenko sees it as transactional. Yes. And they both agree to disagree about the relationship, but now it's getting to a point where something is going to have to give. On consensus on foreign policy, I'm curious about this. There's an old saying, Russian liberalism stops at the Ukrainian border. And I want to see, I mean, I'm taking a wait and see attitude on this because right now I am skeptical of this.
Okay. All right. I'm going to do a final round of questions. Just gentleman there.
Thank you.
Just quickly, because we're running
Two very
fast.
quick comments that I would like you to comment about.
One comment.
One comment, two
One
parts.
comment.
The almost cavalier attitude about moving Russia to the West, which we had that shot, is done. It's not going to happen. We screwed it up right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then the question of a national idea, let's not dismiss the concept of a remarkable 180-degree turn from Marxism-Leninism to what some of you mentioned before, a conservative, nationalist, orthodox state. That means something, and it attracts in Western Europe in particular.
Okay, next, over here.
Good afternoon. My name is Tala. I'm from Georgia. I'm participant of New Security Leaders Program. My question goes to you. Today, 20% of Georgia's territories are occupied by the Russian Federation. I'd like to know, from your opinion, is Russia occupant? My first question. And if there is no Putin, how do you see the continuation on the occupied regions?
Okay, gentleman in front row here. Just over here, front row. Yeah.
Onushkevich, Euro-Atlantic Association. Two quick questions. The first question:
Just one question, please.
What is the role of certain ideology? The ideology is that Russia represents another civilization which is in conflict with Western civilization. And the second question is on the current.
I'll have to. Okay. There are too many questions. So just behind you, Zach. Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much, Bobo. Zach Pakin, University of Kent. Thank you to all the panelists for some very thoughtful comments. I just wanted to take issue with this notion that Russian liberalism should be considered to be different 100% from the notion of sistema that exists in Russia. Many conservative critics would actually acknowledge at this point that the fundamental parameters of the state, whether it's the neoliberal economic system, even with state intervention, or the state institutions, have a liberal character. So how's that tension going to resolve itself between the fundamentally built-in liberal tendencies that are associated with post-Cold War Russia's quote-unquote attempt to return to Europe and the other sort of illiberal elements of the system? Okay, gentleman over there.
Yes, I'm Marko Hyvönen from the Alexander Institute, Finland. I would like to warn about the essentializing Russia. We speak about Russia in terms of liberalism or in terms of non-Western approaches and even in terms of sistema. But even the sistema has counterforces. And now I think what we are facing in the ideological front at the moment is a conservative turn, which is a hegemonic effort by the government in order to create an ideology, but there are also counterforces. And are these counterforces a key to the change? This is my question.
Okay, and question there.
Mariana Fakhurdinova, New Europe Center, Ukraine. My question is, it was mentioned so that to undermine the system, there is a need to have fraction in the elites and the massive rights by the population. So the question is, should it be somehow supported by the activists, by the opposition? So should it be somehow assisted and promoted, or shall we just wait and see where it goes?
And I'm going to add my trivial question: what happens in 2024? Let's go in reverse order. Brian.
This is Alina's DC parlor game. We all meet in a secret location and discuss this all the time. I fully expect the current elite to try to perpetuate Putin's rule as far as, and there's, as Alina pointed out, there's several possibilities of doing this. A union state with Belarus, there's a discussion of the Государственный Совет, what they call the Chinese model, or you can do another castling move. I don't think it matters which one of these they pull out. They have, I don't think they've decided which one of these they're going to do. We're going to begin to see movement toward this after the State Duma elections in 2021. That's going to be the kickoff of this season, and then all this will play out. The wild card in this are people like Vladimir in this new generation that's on the streets right now. How is it going to play out in that situation, and how much force are the elites ready to use? Are they going to go all Tiananmen Square or not? And this is an open question right now.
Okay, Alina.
I actually would rather not comment on most of the questions, except to say one small thing, or two small things. One, this big question of who lost Russia. Yeah. Right? This came up, and I think the illusion there was that the West lost Russia. Mm-hmm. And I think that narrative is false, first of all. The West didn't lose Russia. Russia lost Russia at the end of the day. Mistakes were made on both sides, as the U.S. president sometimes says.
Set up for you.
I actually just wanted to say something different, which is that I wanted to actually acknowledge your role in all of this and your colleagues' roles, like some of the people you mentioned, like Ilya Yashin and Navalny, and Lyubov Sobol, who are operating and remain in Russia today. Many people have left because you're being harassed, you're being jailed, you're being treated like non-citizens. And the fact that there are people like you still in Russia who are there to fight for their country, I just want to point out how admirable that is and how we should do everything we can to support your efforts in a way that is most helpful to you. But you have to, I think you have been telling us what that means. And I'm also very privileged to know Vladimir Karamurza as well, as you do. And I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that you're very brave and courageous to be doing what you're doing in Russia today.
I would second that wholeheartedly.
Nicely to you, Vladimir. The last word is
Thank you very much, Alina. And what happens in 2024? Nothing happens in 2024. If we keep putting out earlier, I mean, there will be already a democratic government. If we won't manage it, he will extend his term.
Sure.
So there will be some sort of operation for it. He's not going anywhere. I don't believe in any successor rumors that are taking place. On the Belarus issue, I think, you know, integrating Belarus is part of, you know, they were forced to have a plan. Let's invent something for 2024. So the number of ideas is short. So what do? Integrate with Belarus, a perpetual thing, right? Even rumored even in the late Yeltsin's era. But the problem is that it's not as sexy as Crimea. No. Russians generally don't care about integrating Belarus. I'd say most would take it as a burden. We will have to finance them if we integrate them. And therefore, I think they will come up with something else. This is just being discussed as a routine thing, but it's not igniting with the society. And an important point about the foreign policy. Yes, foreign policy is one of the very, very few elements of Vladimir Putin's policy which is supported by the majority of the Russian population. Because the Russian population disapproves most of what Vladimir Putin does in terms of his actual policies, except foreign policy. But at the same time, it doesn't really matter. It's not being considered as an important thing. It's like maybe it makes it into top 30 of the priority issues for Russians. I'd say probably top 40 the best. So this is the good news that Russians support Putin's policies abroad, but they just generally don't care too much. So there is a lot of room for us to make them rethink what's going on. And normalization of relations with the West and with civilized world will bring so many economic benefits, so they will feel the difference between aggressive policies versus normalization. We will do our best to capitalize on it. And the Ukrainian and Crimean issue, it's been said that by somebody that Russian liberals and the Ukrainian question, we love the idea of having such a beautiful and talented neighbors as Ukrainians. We always, I speak not only for myself but my opposition colleagues, we always wanted to treat Ukraine as a fully sovereign, equal neighbor. And I used to argue about that 20 years ago with Chubais, when he wrote his Liberal Empire article, arguing that we need to softly integrate the neighboring countries by acquiring their strategic assets. I was among those who said, look, this is a wrong approach. We need to treat neighboring countries as equals or we'll get into trouble, which we did.
Ladies and gentlemen, in our understandable focus on China, we often forget or underestimate the importance of Russia. Clearly, Russia is going to remain hugely important. What it does and how the world interacts with it will be hugely important. And I'd like to, I hope, we can all join in thanking our wonderful panelists for shedding such great light on this. Vladimir Milov, Alina Polyakova, Brian Whitmore.